Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to uncover one of the absolute most fascinating, hidden truths of American military history. We're talking about the forgotten genius of the Civil War, George Henry Thomas. You know, we often think the history books have it all perfectly figured out, right? But today, we are looking at a man who orchestrated virtually flawless victories, only to be practically erased from our collective memory. It's a really wild story.
So if I threw this question at you right now, who was the greatest general of the American Civil War? What name instantly springs to mind? For most people, the usual answers are almost always Robert E. Lee, Ulysses S. Grant, or maybe William T. Sherman. I mean, those are the household names. Those are the men who've had countless books written about them, whose strategies are endlessly debated, and whose faces are basically etched into the entire mythology of the era. But what if the actual answer, based purely on a completely clean, victorious battlefield record, wasn't any of those three?
Because there are serious scholars out there. We're not talking about casual hobbyists here, but highly respected historians like Wiley Sword, who wrote the definitive account of the Nashville campaign, and Benson Bobb, who literally wrote the book on Thomas, and they argue that George Thomas was, in fact, the most capable general the Civil War produced. They actually acknowledge that his contributions to the Union victory were equal to, or maybe even greater than the men who actually got all the credit. Now, to really understand why they make such a bold claim, we have to drop right into the middle of one of the most tense, high-stakes moments of the entire war.
Picture this. The scene is December 1864. Out east, Ulysses S. Grant has Robert E. Lee pinned down in a brutal, bloody trench war at Petersburg. But out west in Tennessee, things have gone dangerously wrong. A Confederate army under the command of John Bell Hood has audaciously marched north into Union territory and is sitting right outside Nashville. And the Union general charged of destroying him is none other than George Henry Thomas. But Thomas is doing something that is making Grant want to literally tear the telegraph wires right out of the wall. He's waiting, just waiting. Grant is furiously firing off dispatch after dispatch. Move, attack, I cannot delay this any longer. Grant is so angry he actually drafts orders to relieve Thomas of command, sends another General West to take over, and eventually hops on a train himself, completely unable to just sit still in Washington.
Now, to understand why Thomas was risking his entire career by waiting, we really just need to look at how his flawless track record builds up to this moment. This wasn't some untested rookie commander. In January 1862, Thomas won at Mill Springs, which was the very first significant Union land victory in the West. Then, in September 1863, when the Union army around him just entirely disintegrated at Chickamauga, Thomas held firm. He saved the army from a massive strategic catastrophe and earned the legendary nickname the Rock of Chickamauga. By November 1863, he broke the Confederate siege at Missionary Ridge. The guy's record was incredible. Through 4 years of war, going up against all kinds of generals, George Thomas went to the fight and came home with a win every single time. He simply didn't lose battles.
And right before Nashville, Hood's Confederate Army had already severely mauled themselves fighting Union forces at a place called Franklin. So the absolute crucial point here is this staggering, almost unbelievable number, 6. In a single afternoon at Franklin, making 11 desperate frontal assaults against Union entrenchments, Hood lost 6 Confederate generals killed. That is a figure so devastating it barely even seems possible. Hood lost the absolute core of his offensive fighting strength right there on that field, and a few days later, he was sitting in front of Nashville with a totally depleted army, just waiting for Thomas to make a move.
So why was Thomas waiting? He wasn't stalling out of timidity, and he certainly wasn't just being slow for slowness' sake. As our sources explain, Thomas understood something that Grant, fuming back in Washington, just didn't quite grasp. It wasn't enough to merely stop Hood, because if you just pushed Hood back, his army would retreat, reconstitute somewhere down south, and come right back to fight again in the spring. Thomas was waiting because his cavalry horses were completely broken down. He absolutely refused to fight without a fully capable cavalry because he wasn't just building an instrument to repel the enemy, he was meticulously building an instrument of total destruction. And when Thomas finally attacked on December 15th, it was an absolute masterclass. Operationally, it was a clinic. He hit Hood's flank, forced the line to contract, hit them again the very next day, and then unleashed his fully equipped cavalry to run down the retreating infantry. Hood's roughly 40,000-strong Confederate Army of Tennessee was shredded and scattered so thoroughly that it basically ceased to exist as a fighting force forever. And the kicker, in completely dismantling a major Confederate army, Thomas lost fewer than 3,000 men. It was a swift, operationally complete victory that Grant, for all his famous bulldog persistence, never really engineered himself. And this brings us to a really fascinating comparison that historians often debate. On one hand, you have Robert E. Lee. Lee is widely remembered as a military genius, right? His audacity at places like Chancellorsville is studied all over the world.
But as the source notes, that brilliance came at a truly tragic, staggering cost. Lee routinely suffered unsustainable casualties, losing a quarter of his army in a single day at Antietam, and a third of his force over 3 days at Gettysburg, including the disastrous Pickett's Charge. Lee's strategic culture basically bled his own army out. On the other hand, we have George H. Thomas. His style was defined by methodical preparation, and his record is incredibly clean. He didn't hemorrhage troops in unwinnable assaults. Given the time and conditions he demanded, he won every single time.
Which brings us to the central mystery of this whole explainer. Think about it. If George Henry Thomas was this effective, if he possessed a battlefield record cleaner than Grant's, Sherman's, and Lee's, why isn't he a household name? Why did history seemingly just completely forget him?
Well, the answer is layered. According to historical analysis, there are 3 primary reasons Thomas faded into obscurity: Virginia's post-war mythology, his total lack of self-promotion, and his methodical style of command. Let's break these down one by one to see exactly how a genius gets erased from history.
First up, we have the tragedy of his origins. You see, Thomas was born in Virginia, but when the war broke out, he simply decided that the uniform he swore his oath in was the uniform he was going to keep wearing. He stayed loyal to the Union. Because of this, the post-war lost cause narrative, which romanticized the Confederacy and centered its myth-making around Virginian heroes like Lee and Stonewall Jackson, well, they had absolutely no use for him. Worse than that, Thomas was a Virginian who kept winning while the Confederacy's great men were losing. He was a glaring embarrassment to their mythology, so he was excluded. Even his own family treated him like a traitor. When news of his death reached his sisters in 1870, they actually refused to mourn him. Years earlier, they had turned his portrait in the family home to face the wall and returned all his letters unopened.
The second reason is that Thomas was, frankly, terrible at PR. In the 1860s, having a publicist meant having newspaper allies and powerful political sponsors. Grant had the White House to amplify his legacy. Sherman wrote these vivid, highly readable memoirs centered almost entirely around himself. Thomas? He had zero instinct for self-promotion. He wrote his official reports, filed his dispatches, gave very few interviews, and never wrote a single memoir. Tragically, he died of a stroke in 1870 at just 53 years old, which was well before the era of major Civil War monument building had even begun. So the men who ended up writing the histories were the ones who served under Grant, Sherman, and Lee, not Thomas.
And this lack of self-promotion had very real consequences for his legacy. Let's jump back for a second to November 1863 at Missionary Ridge. Grant had designed this grand plan where Sherman was supposed to make the main attack, while Thomas's men were given a secondary mission: just capture the rifle pits at the base of the ridge and wait. But Sherman's assault totally stalled out. Meanwhile, Thomas's men took the pits at the base, and then, completely unprompted, they just kept going right up an almost impregnable hill. Grant, watching this unfold, turned to Thomas and asked, "Who gave those men orders to charge the ridge?" Thomas calmly replied that it wasn't him. Grant then ominously stated that if the assault failed, someone was going to answer for it.
But it didn't fail. They drove the Confederate forces completely off the ridge in one of the most remarkable infantry charges of the entire war. And why did they charge? Because they were operating on a deep collective understanding of what Thomas had taught them. And frankly, they were just tired of waiting. It was a stunning triumph built on the incredible trust between Thomas and his army. But because Thomas didn't write the history books, Grant basically absorbed this incredible victory into his own memoirs. In the grand narrative of the Grant victory, Thomas was written about as if he were just a reliable piece of furniture in the room, present and functional for sure, but never the main subject.
Which leads us to the third and perhaps most uncomfortable reason for his obscurity. Thomas's style simply doesn't fit the narrative we tend to demand from our military heroes. American mythology loves speed, aggression, and theatrical flair. We love commanders who attack unexpectedly and move way faster than the enemy. Lee, Grant, and Sherman all fit that bold archetype perfectly. But Thomas's story, it's about patience. It's about not attacking until every single condition for complete, overwhelming victory is met, and then striking with absolute precision. That methodical style produces the cleanest combat record of the war, but let's be honest, it doesn't really make for an action-packed movie or a dramatic legend.
Which leaves us with a really fascinating final thought to consider. The historical record asks us to sit with someone who doesn't give us the exciting, tragic story we've been kind of trained to want. It really forces us to ask ourselves, when we look back at history, what is it that we actually value? Do we prefer the quiet, methodical, and incredibly effective preparation that saves lives and conclusively wins campaigns? Or are we inevitably drawn to theatrical grandeur, audacious risks, and the romanticized tragedy of immense loss? It's a profound question about how history is written, and it definitely makes you wonder just how many other methodical geniuses we've forgotten along the way. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this sparked your curiosity, and I'll catch you